Hey, Honors American History 1 students, this is Ms. Drake coming at you live, pre-recorded again. And this is the second video that I have for you this week. It's a review of nationalism. Now, strange, believe it or not, that my power's out. So I'm bringing this to you with the light of my cell phone and my laptop. So hopefully this is going to be clear and understandable, and I won't lose power in my cell phone or my laptop. But today's review of nationalism, I'd like to go over some of the pictures that we didn't get a chance to look at when we were in class as we were studying nationalism, expansionism, and sectionalism. These are just some really cool pictures and really great demonstrations of nationalism. There's no assignment attached to this particular video. However, what I would like to be able to do is next week, as reviewing expansionism and sectionalism, to come back to some of the key topics from this particular video. So I wanted to get started with this guy over here. You probably know him as George Washington, our first president. And I chose a lot of these pictures mainly because these are the things that I think we're kind of familiar with. But I chose George Washington as our exemplar for the one person that could really demonstrate how Americans felt about themselves in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Remember some key dates that we have. In 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence. In 1789, we have the U.S. Constitution. Then, of course, we're going to have the War of 1812. So we defeated the British, not only in the American Revolution, but also in the War of 1812. We have the era of good feelings, so we're feeling great about ourselves. So this whole concept of nationalism is a pretty big deal for us. So with this first picture, what I want to do is to talk about how this demonstrates nationalism. Well, of course, this is a very stately George Washington, painted somewhere around the early 1800s by a painter named Gilbert Stuart. And so as I was reading about this a little bit, I don't think that George Washington was necessarily, or would have been necessarily, happy to know that this was probably one of his most famous pictures, because according to what I've read, that his mouth is kind of pressed thin, and he doesn't look very happy. I read somewhere that maybe it was because his false teeth were giving him a little bit of trouble, and he just didn't feel like smiling. But here he looks very stately, almost kingly to a certain extent, which of course was very dangerous at that time with this whole idea of having a king as a president. However, this is our version, the American version of what we have as an executive leader. So this is the exemplar to get started with, and I'll bet that most of you have seen this particular picture of George Washington. Now I'm going to duck out of the screen here, and I'm going to let you take a look at this one, because this one always, for me, is very interesting. This is a statue, a 12-ton marble statue that's now located at the Smithsonian of George Washington, created by a guy named Horatio Greenough. And so what I thought was pretty interesting about this, and you can read some on the right side of your screen, that basically he looks like, if you can think about it, maybe some sort of Greco-Roman godlike thing. And so if you'll look kind of in the middle of your screen, I'll put my cursor right over here, that this robe statue of Washington was executed in what we call the neoclassical style. And so the neoclassical style is inspired by the ideas from Greece and from Rome. Greece, of course, being the world's first democracy, and then there's, of course, George Washington being our first president upholding our democracy. So George Washington is seated here, kind of like an Olympian Zeus, as it's called. And on top of that, this work depicts the Greek god Apollo and an infant Hercules on the sides. And then, of course, he's holding this giant sword, which is going to represent, power, but he's going to relinquish his military power to the people. So he's handing that over to the people. Now, of course, Greenough understood that this is probably not the first thing that people came to think of, a buff George Washington, kind of like a Roman god seated on a throne, because of many reasons. First of all, it's a shirtless George Washington. So that's worse than the shirtless Vladimir Putin pictures that I oftentimes see. So when you're looking at the early 1800s, this was not really an appropriate statue, because you're looking at a half-clothed man, and that's inappropriate. but also he's looking more like a king. And of course, we're still afraid of executive power, and that's not the exact image that we wanted to have. However, it is very nationalistic because it does talk about our origins, our Greco-Roman origins, when we're looking back to the ideas of Greece being the first democracy and the Roman Empire being an area of power in terms of our history. Now, of course, this happens to be one of my favorite portraits, mainly because we've talked about how guys presented a calf, how they look at their leg and they stick out their leg, kind of. So this is a military portrait of George Washington. I found this and I couldn't find a lot of background information about that, but I thought it was still very interesting about his stance. And in the background, if you're looking at the entire picture, of course, George Washington stands out in all the colors that he has there. And he's got his hand propped up on his hip and he's standing there very authoritative and in control and confident. And all this stuff is going on back behind him in the background. But this is who George Washington would be, this confident leader, of course, and then he's there presenting a calf, so he's the perfect example of the perfect male, and that's who we have as our nation's first leader. So this particular painting is called The Death of General Mercer at the Battle of Princeton. It's a painting by John Trumbull, and what I thought was interesting about this in general is it took Trumbull like 45 years to complete this thing. He started out with sketches, oil painting, all kinds of things. He just, he procrastinated big time. But what I wanted you to figure out is, where is George Washington? Well, I kind of had to put a square around him because it took me a while to find him too. But he's the guy right here on the horse. So this is a major battle. You're looking at the time period of the American Revolution, and all these folks here are in battle. That there's General Mercer, who American, actually going to be killed as a result of this battle. And you see here, incoming George Washington. He's looking off not at the major battle itself, but he's so confident of a leader that he has this in command in terms of looking at him marching into battle and entering the battle scene. So it's very nationalistic, looking at what kind of leader that we had as our first president. I'm going to duck out of the screen again here too, because I'm pretty sure you've seen this very familiar painting, very famous. It's Washington crossing the Delaware, which I think is kind of funny the way this is painted. So again, on the left-hand side of your screen, you can read about that a little bit. Washington, of course, was going to conduct a surprise attack on a Hessian garrison during the Revolutionary War. And so this becomes a very iconic picture for American victory. You've got these guys who were in the boat, and, they're carrying the American flag, and there's George Washington standing up, in the boat. He's got his eyes focused on the goal there. And even the New York Evening Mirror, a publication, boldly called it the grandest, most majestic, most effective painting ever exhibited in America. And it's huge. This thing is a pretty big picture. And so I think what's pretty interesting about this is not actually how Washington would have crossed the Delaware. Not at all. I mean, if you're going to do a surprise attack, this does not look surprising at all. You've got these people standing up in bright colored clothes. They're not going to do that. You'll notice the ice floating around there. They're going to try to get in to attack as quickly, as quietly as possible, and of course without standing up with his leg propped up on the side of the boat. So this is not an accurate portrayal of Washington crossing the Delaware. However, it is accurate for nationalism. So this is what Americans are thinking. It's, go America. And we have so much of that even now, especially in crisis situations. When you look at the Gulf War, when you look at looking at all different kinds of wars, the war on terrorism after 9/11, and even now during the COVID-19 crisis, we see Americans coming together with nationalism. And so we see that reflected in society. And the same thing's happening here in this painting. Again, I'm ducking out of this picture too, these four pictures. These are landscape paintings by Thomas Cole. And I think they're beautiful. But in the late 1700s and early 1800s, we had a lot of painters that were painting landscapes of America. Because if you can, think of it, this is at the time period where we're expanding. So this links to expansionism. So we have, the Louisiana Purchase, for example. And so a lot of these Americans who are painters were painting landscapes. Actually, Thomas Cole is one of the founding fathers, I guess you could say, of the Hudson River School for Art. And so that's a very famous school where a lot of artists are a part of that, and they're going to be painting nationalistic images of America and what we see. So a lot of these are big, beautiful, bold, mountainous, wide, big sky kind of paintings. Of course, you really don't see, other things in the video, such as in the pictures, such as Native Americans or slaves. These are just landscapes. And so Thomas Cole's whole idea was to demonstrate how beautiful America can be. And the one on the upper left and the one on the bottom right, pretty much the same painting there, where you're looking at it. It's just different perspectives and images. And of course, you're looking at the bright colors and how beautiful the landscape is. And so that, again, is part of our nationalistic era. So I'm coming back in the video here to talk about Asher Durand. And I think this one up here is probably my favorite. I like that. Not only because it just has landscape in it, but also has people in it. And so I like to see the images, especially the nationalistic images with people. And that to me kind of relates to history a little more. But Asher Durand was also famous for a lot of his landscape portraits. And again, you see the big sky, the mountains, the waters. This is just American nature at its finest. And so this also exemplifies American nationalism. So now that we've looked at two major landscape painters, let's talk about some other paintings that are American, that are nationalistic, and maybe even a little bit regarding sectionalism. So the painting up here at the top, of course, is you're looking at folks that are hunting. And so William Sidney Mount was really well known for not only painting pictures of just ordinary things, but also, like the painting over here to the left, about some social and political issues, where you're looking at, socioeconomic classes, and you're looking at problems with race, for example. And so he was a painter that actually looked at the reality of human life in America in the time period of the late 1700s and the early 1800s. These become a part of history, of course, because they look at exactly what was going on. We didn't have video at the time. So these pictures are going to help to demonstrate what life was like during the time period of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Then we have Charles Giroix's painting of the cotton plantation. And so obviously now we're getting into more sectionalism, where you're looking at this is what a cotton plantation looks like. Strangely, however, it doesn't really look too bad. I mean, you've got this beautiful landscape. You've got these small figures that really doesn't demonstrate the hard labor of slavery at the time. So this in particular doesn't look all that bad. And so a lot of the paintings, of course, depending on the painter and the perspective of the painter, are going to spin a different perspective on some of the socio-economic problems and the racial problems that are happening in the late 1700s and early 1800s. However, let's take a look at the next picture. And so this, of course, demonstrates sectionalism, very much so. So air or ire crows after the sale. And so you see a lot going on here. You see a lot of colors and a lot of vibrancy. And of course, you see a lot going on. Your eyes are often drawn to the center point of the picture. But remember, we talked about the see, think, wonder strategy that works for political cartoons. It works for these paintings as well. I mean, look at what's going on in the background. It looks like you've got a city, you've got some industry going on here. You see all of these people participating in kind of what's going on. Lots of little different things happening. So it's very confusing, a lot of bustling and hustling around. And so this is looking at, of course, the slave trade in and of itself. And so that's part, of course, then going on into sectionalism that we're going to talk about more next week. And just to bring it back to our first pictures that we had about George Washington and neoclassical style architecture, remember that's Greco-Roman style architecture, there's a couple of images that I would really like for us to take a look at. And so one of these, of course, is going to be the types of columns that were used. I'm going to try to move myself around a little bit so you can see them better. The Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns and types of columns that were used in Greece. And so, again, moving myself around a little bit. So when you look at these buildings, we actually have a style of architecture called the Federalist style of architecture early on in our country. And that, of course, is a nationalistic perspective as well, a type of architecture. And it's really well known by its symmetry and use of geometric shapes. So when you look at the Parthenon here, you see I've drawn in with my lovely blue pen here that there is a triangle at the top. You've got these columns, and then they are evenly spaced. So you're looking at symmetry and you're looking at proportion. So the same is true with a lot of the images that we have for government. So I think this is the Boston State House, if I remember correctly. But if you'll take a look, I've tried to draw the line straight down the middle of the image of the Boston State House, or whatever government building that this was. And so it's got a lot of symmetry happening, and it's got that dome across the top. That's actually very much from Rome, where they're using the dome feature or the rotunda. But the symmetry comes from really Greece as well as Rome. And so again, this is a Federalist style architecture. This is just a house. And so a lot of houses are, of course, built in the 1700s and 1800s, use this Federalist style of architecture where there's symmetry. I drew a line straight down, kind of straight down the middle of the house. So there's even numbers of windows on each side of the house. Of course, you've got the columns there. And of course, the Monticello, which also has the dome at the top. And you've got the triangle there. I've drawn that in blue on the porch with the columns, kind of like the Parthenon. And then here, same thing with the buildings here, government buildings. You've got this government building, of course, it's very symmetrical. So that means, of course, that it's also based on this neoclassical or Federalist style of architecture based on the ideas of Greece and Rome. So in summary, these ideas of nationalism in the late 1700s and early 1800s, where we're winning the American Revolution, we're building our own economy, we have our own society, we have our own government, we win the War of 1812. So these are some major things that are happening. And these ideas are evident. We get this from history in paintings, say of significant people like George Washington, of landscapes, of everyday life, even though they also show sectionalism in architecture. Also, one thing we haven't touched on, of course, are writings, literature. Literature of this time period also can demonstrate nationalism. It mainly shows who we are as a nation and our national identity. Thank you for watching this video. And so hopefully next week I'll have a couple more to review sectionalism and expansionism. See you guys then.